Okay, are we all set? Yes. Most of the night, in fact, all the rest of the night, you're not going to see me. I'm going to be working from the computer, and we're going to continue where we left off last time. Last time we spoke about transits of Pluto, and this time we're going to look at transits of Neptune. We're going to look at the same horoscope, which happens to be mine, which is a dangerous thing to do, but at my age, few things are to bother. So I'll switch over to the computer. This is the horoscope. It's a better version for viewing than last time, but I still haven't gotten exactly the version that I want yet. We see Virgo rising, and Neptune is on the ascendant, just above the ascendant in the 12th house. So we're going to be working a lot with Neptune. And if you get a picture of this chart, all right. Now let's look at the list of all right. This is the list of Neptune transits. Again, I have selected only conjunctions and oppositions, and it will be clear that oppositions are not as strong usually as conjunctions. We'll have more to say about that along the way. Now, it's a good idea. I'm assuming that most people are familiar with astrology when I do talks on this level. But it's possible that some people are not familiar with astrology. And in that case, if you want to study more about Neptune, let's see, it's not the one we're looking for yet. This is the one we're looking for. All right, these are two URLs. The top one is from Topics in Astrology, and it is a talk somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes just about Neptune. So if you want to familiarize yourself, this is the place to go. The other is, I have a keyword book, and this is the URL for the keyword book. In the back of the book are keywords for every planet, every sign, every house, even elements and things like that. So I'll leave this up here for a moment or two, and if you ever want to look back, you can always take a screenshot of this so that you can get to what you want to get to. All right, we'll set that aside for a while. This is a dream. I wish I've had this for years. All right, we're back at the Neptune transits. Now, we run into some of the same problems with Neptune that we did with Pluto, because both Neptune and Pluto are octave planets. And the true thing that octave planets point to are transcendental things, very high states of spirit. By transcendent, it means that they are beyond concrete thought. So they are above most thinking that we do. So there are from purely spiritual worlds and spiritual worlds for which you have to have intuition You'd think it's not irrational, it's not sub-rational, it's ultra-rational. There's a wisdom or a truth that is beyond what the concrete thinking can contain. So we're dealing with transcendental planets, and only a very few people can address them directly. Fewest of all, Pluto, but Neptune, very few people can address them. They don't have the spiritual vision to do that. All of the spiritual worlds have that characteristic of being that we can't comprehend them directly, or we can't grasp them, or we can't apprehend them in total. When you have the spiritual experience is in itself a total thing. So, what we have to look at are not complete or not direct influences that come from transcendental worlds. So they do have influences on people. Their influences are much more psychic than we would call them physical, and they affect us in ways that are always surprising, not easy to guess ahead of time. Now, because of the rarity of the ability to be receptive to them, even if one does pick up on them, the experience will not always be completely clear. Now, some people do have clairvoyance, true clairvoyance. We're not talking about something that happens that can't be controlled, but some people have worked for many lives to gain control of their consciousness and to be able to fix their consciousness into other worlds, and such people are capable of responding to the transcendental planet. So a lot of people respond to the influences by sensitivity. These are not seers, these are some people who are sensitive and they are worked upon. When that is the case, it is almost always something psychological, and there's always a personal element to it. Now, the masses do respond to octave planets, but they're not always aware of what's going on. There are manias that overtake society, and sometimes there are swoops of spiritual directions or spiritual consciousness that people get into. Like in the late 1880s, there was a lot of mediumship, and the whole country was taken with mediumship. And that's an example of Neptune being active in the world. If we take an example, Pluto, who we looked at last time, does affect people even on the lowest level, but it does not affect them as a conscious ability. In such a case, Pluto represents instincts, things that people do that are basic to their creation. You might say that the spirit is sleeping in the material realms, and the divine spirit, which is represented by Pluto, sleeps in the chemical physical world, and it exists there as an instinct. Now, it can be manifest for many people, and for most people, when they experience Pluto, they're experiencing something like terror. Pluto is the planet of terror. When we come to Neptune, what it represents is not as distant as Pluto, but it has its own problems. And the problems with Neptune are subtlety. Pluto is subtle, but it's like a blind subtlety. It's dumb, so to speak, or it's blind or dumb, something of that nature. Now, we mentioned that last week when we looked at Pluto transits. We said that when Pluto was very strong, it was a matter, there were things that I was compelled to do. I had compunctions within myself to do something, and I had no choice about doing it. I had to do that, like it or not. I was overpowered in a way, not an overpowered like when somebody overtakes your consciousness or something like that, but I was overpowered by the astral circumstances of my life. There was no flavor to it, just power. Now Neptune is different. Neptune is always different. Neptune is weird. With Neptune, there's always a suspicion that the experience of what that is Neptunian is not what it appears to be. Neptune is a planet of illusion, and when it's active in your life as a strong focal force, there's likely to be some illusion. If there is an illusion, there is a misunderstanding of it or a miscomprehension of it. And with Neptune, there is the kind of spiritual psychology that you can always get around the influence, that you can do it, you can deal with the situation, and it becomes point, counterpoint, point, counterpoint. It's like a spy versus spy situation. I don't know if you ever used to read Mad Magazine. There used to be a cartoon in Mad Magazine called Spy versus Spy, where one spy would produce a ruse of some kind, and then the other would have a counter one, and then there would be a counter. That's the kind of thing that happens with Neptune. There's always a tendency to try and to second guess. Now, with Neptune, a person can always be psyched out, as we say in the common language. You can be psyched out of something, or you can be psyched into something. Neptune is very excellent at being a con person. And with Neptune, there is a feeling of certainty, even though there is in the background a suspicion maybe that this isn't so certain. So Neptune has that coy way about it. As said earlier, Neptune is the planet of illusion. Thus, Neptune rules illusory experience. There is real experience, so the illusion or allusion about it is not a complete illusion. And things are layered. Like it's sort of like an Agatha Christie novel. You uncover one thing and you think you've got it, and then there's another layer and you uncover it. Neptune has that flavor about it. As said earlier, Neptune is a planet of confusion. And confusion seems to be very akin to illusion. Illusion produces all kinds of confusions. And with Neptune, there is often a confusion of identity. Every planet in every chart has rules somebody in your life. Now, Neptune represents opportunities in people that had confusions of identity. I had a friend that was named Mr. Miller, and Mr. Miller was interested in secret or quasi-secret societies. He belonged to the Masons and things like that. And he went to, as a guest, he went to a meeting of this semi-secret society, and he didn't know it, but in that group or in that audience, there was another man that had the same identical name as he had. And it came time to announce the candidates for initiation into this society, and they called off the name, and my friend was befuddled but he went up to the speaker stand where the speaker was, and he got initiated into the organization even though he was the wrong man. I don't know if the other man with the same name was in the audience or not, but that's the kind of thing that happens with confusion of identity. With something like this, if you have Neptune in the 7th house, a young woman have Neptune in the 7th house, and be at the marriage ceremony and say "I do" at the wrong time, and end up being married to the minister instead of her spouse. That's a little crazy, but you get the idea. All right, we are again. This is the horoscope that we are dealing with. And we are again looking at Neptune in Virgo at 22 degrees and some minutes, and the ascendant is 24 and some minutes. And in that, the ruler of the ascendant is Mercury. It's down here in Virgo, and Mercury is sextile to the ascendant, which it rules, and Mercury is sextile to Neptune. And across the way is the moon. And the moon is opposite to the ascendant, and it's trine to Mercury. So we have a three-way trine, a sextile, a trine, and an opposition. Now, we're looking at this horoscope, which happens to be mine, and please be kind in your judgment of me. All right. Now, I'm doing all of this from memory and checking some things against records and things like that. And this is an important thing to do. I'm doing it for the reason that it gives, I understand everything that took place, or pretty much understand everything that took place in my life, and therefore it's easy for me to show how the effect of the event came about, what it meant, and things like that. Everybody should do this at several times in their life. The past is factual. What happened, happened. If we just dealt with memory alone, we tend to lie to ourselves, and we have a lot of mismemories. But if you cross-check your memory with the astrological positionings, you're likely to get a lot out of them. Even when we look at the facts of the situation, that does happen, but it's less likely to. Now, that's especially something to be careful with when we're dealing with Neptune, because Neptune is kind of slippery, and we'll have a lot of psychic misunderstandings of ourselves. We have just said that Neptune is in the 12th house, just above the ascendant. Planets above the ascendant that are conjunct to it, that are near to it, usually indicate conditions before birth, right before birth. I once worked with a young woman who had a very dark view of life and was pessimistic and was down on everything. And when I looked at the chart, Saturn was conjoined the ascendant, but from the 12th house. And in the course of working with this young woman, it came out that her father was in law school when her mother got pregnant. And he did the honorable thing and took a job and supported the family and brought up the child. But all through his life, he resented the fact that he never was able to become an attorney the way he wanted to. And he not only resented that fact of life, he resented his daughter. And in that resentment of his daughter, that whether it was spoken or whether it was tacit, that influenced her. And she had a very, like a shadow that was cast over her life, and it was hard for her to have a positive life. So that is a good example of how something before birth affects the personality throughout life by what just happened. Now, in this horoscope, Neptune conjoins the ascendant. And it went backwards afterwards. It retrograded, and then it came forward over the ascendant again. Now, there are two events that are actual or potential about the Neptune conjoining the ascendant by transit in one of those two transits that are listed on the chart. Now, the first is the potential. I don't know the exact facts of it. It is conceivable that I was an ether baby. If you know what an ether baby is, in those times, in the 30s, sometimes when a woman was having a lot of pain, they would give her ether as anesthetic, and she would give birth under ether. I don't know if that was with me. I did get a lot of facts from my mother about my life, about my early life, but I never asked her about the circumstances of my birth. So that one has to be only potential. There was a doctor in attendance, and this is colloquial. I don't know that it's really true, but my father tells me that when I was born, the doctor said to him, "Well, you always wanted a coonhound, and now you have one." It was that I was born with my ears flopped over forward, the way hound dogs have them. My father used to tease me about that for years. I got quite a bit of teasing from my father. But that's the only circumstance that I know about the exact birth itself. Now, the other event about Neptune in the 12th house conjoining the ascendant is that is something very, very unusual, very rare. There are different kinds of memory. The conscious memory through your brain, where you try to remember what happened the day before, is ruled by Mercury. And there's an instinctual pictorial memory that is ruled by the moon. But there is a super memory that is ruled by Neptune. Sometimes it is associated with the memory of nature, where everything that happens in the world is impressed on the ethers, and a person who is sufficiently sensitive and sufficiently in control can read anything out of the memory of nature, and it's like looking at a movie. It's filmed in that way. So that super memory that is Neptune is sometimes manifest. I have, from time to time, I have all three types of memory to various degrees. Sometimes the moon Mercury is the strongest aspect in the chart, and sometimes I can remember things very clearly with pictures. Now, the memory that we're talking about as the Neptune conjoined the ascendant, either the second or third conjunction, not the birth one, is an event that happened somewhere in my midlife. I would say that it was somewhere in my 40s. I don't know it. Again, it's unfortunate that I didn't keep a journal at that period in life and write down when it happened. This occurred at one of those moments when you're not completely occupied, but you're relaxed and your focus is not on something external that you're making a careful adjustment or something like that, but you're sort of defocused from the external world and relaxed and refocused inside of yourself. And in a moment, and only a moment, I remembered coming back to rebirth before I was reborn. The moments just before I was reborn, it wasn't like thinking of me as a body or anything like that. It was like a spiritual focus, a spiritual consciousness coming back to the body, and it was a chaos. It was a chaos of sound and color and everything else. And it was one of the more remarkable moments in my life. And what happened is it got impressed on my conscious memory so that I can call it back if I need to. All right. Now, because Neptune is so close to the ascendant and there are retrogrades, it's difficult to figure out which memories are which. On top of that, childhood memories from very early ages are really hard to come by. Only one positive memory stands out. And it does so, let's see here, we're looking at the, it's most likely the February 17th, 1939, that memory, that Neptune there, the first Neptune transit, is most likely what is associated with this memory. The memory is, I remember taking my first step. I can even call back the full picture because we had unusual chairs in the kitchen and there were back braces on the chair, sort of like flying buttresses but vertical. And I was clinging to one of those and I let go of it and took my first step. And the positive reinforcement from the entire family was so strong that it was impressed on me that years later I could call it back. Now this is said not to, it's an astrological example, but it should be an example for anyone who deals with very small children. Very small children are extremely impressionable. They are affected by what you do. So be very careful what you even think toward children. All right. Now, Neptune is in Virgo and conjoined the ascendant. That's almost the classic for a neurotic personality. And when you take into account the fact that Neptune is opposite the moon, that reinforces the tendency and leads to a lot of negative personal images involved with neurosis. I must say, I can't deny it, that for quite a bit of my early life, I was neurotic. And I had several neurotic complexes. I think I'm pretty much clear from all of that, but it's taken a lot of work to get to that. Now we're looking at the time here where Neptune goes opposite the moon, the third row down. The moon is opposite Neptune. That's 1940, 1941, in that period. And there were two memorial events that planted conditions for neurosis. Neurosis of looking down on yourself and feeling inferior, or that was called an inferiority complex. My father, when I was a little kid, used to call me a Duppus, which was German for somebody who, spills the pudding and things like that. Both of these events happened within 2 feet of each other, even though they happened at different times. I grew up on a farm, and there was no indoor plumbing. Water was brought in from an outdoor pump, And we had a bathtub, and we had a wash basin, and we had a sink. But the water, when it drained out of the tub or out of the wash basin, it just went into a bucket underneath. And we called that a slop bucket. And one time, there were company, friends from Milwaukee had come, and they were all sitting around the kitchen table, which was adjacent to the bathroom, and everybody was talking, a good conversation, and I was just sort of wandering around, and I somehow managed to fall into the slop bucket, and it was a source of great amusement to many. And so for years and years afterwards, I was teased not only by my family, but family friends from Milwaukee of the kid who fell in the slop bucket. This is the kind of thing that leads to a negative image of yourself and neurosis. The other event occurred right next to the wash basin in the bathroom. My father used to have rubber boots for working in the barn, sometimes working around manure. And he would, when he would come in, he would take off his boots, and he left them right next to the sink, and he was washing his hands or something like that, and went in for supper, and I was sort of again wandering around as a small child, and I looked at them, and there's something about men and peeing that they see things, they want to pee on them. Well, I peed in my father's boots. and that was not taken too kindly by my father, so I not only got scolded. You know, I was struck only one time in my life, and that was by my mother. But otherwise, I was never struck in my entire life, and my mother was justified because I just pressed her to the end. That is the kind of thing where you want to pull your hair out by your fists. I was being that kind of nasty of a kid, and I got slapped. But that's the only time ever in my entire childhood that I was struck. But at any rate, this event of peeing in the boots was again something I was teased about for years and years afterwards. In some ways, my brother was older, and of course the older one is more dignified, and the younger one, especially since I was a goofy Neptune rising kid, gets dumped on, and I was the one who was dumped on. Now, let's move on. We're going to move on down the line now to the Neptune conjoined Mars line here, this fourth line. And this is, we see Mars is in the first house, and Neptune by transit has made its way down to Mars. Now, anybody who has known me for even a few minutes realizes that I have bad posture. And part of that is due because in my formative years, in quite a bit of my life, I had this negative, neurotic personal image. And I didn't carry myself squarely. I didn't carry myself erect. But another part is due to an event that occurred around the time of one of the transits of Neptune to Mars. I think it was the third one. Usually for me, events always happen, not so many events occur on retrograde conjunctions or oppositions, but they occur on the conjunction after a retrograde. That I can't say is a law. I have not tabulated all of them, but in general that seems to be likely what happens. These are the kinds of things you look for if you're working with a horoscope. You look for patterns. You know, there are people that like to precipitate causes immediately. Sometimes you precipitate some things just to get it over with. In this case, things with transiting planets in my horoscope seem to happen after they've been burned in a little bit and are part of me. Now, the first house where Mars is located indicates childhood illnesses. And Mars indicates fevers, childhood fevers. Neptune, when it's involved with illness, if it's prominent in a chart, indicates undiagnosable or misdiagnosed illnesses. And when Neptune is on the ascendant, this tendency is greatly magnified. I had a friend that had Neptune in Leo on the ascendant, and she had a condition of the heart that the doctors never could figure out for years. I think it finally did come to a head, but that was after I knew her and moved on to a different phase of my life. In any case, I had a severe fever at about the time of the last conjunction of Neptune to Mars. And the doctors didn't know what it was because it persisted and persisted. And they thought it was appendicitis. There was not much, they didn't do much with x-rays in those days. And so they thought it was appendicitis, and they were preparing to take my appendix out. When they did one last test at the last moment, and they discovered I had pneumonia. That's quite a misdiagnosis, from appendicitis to pneumonia. And that was just the time when penicillin was coming into use. And even though I was very, very ill, they gave me massive doses of penicillin quite frequently. And I came out of it. But when I came out of it, my energy was never the same. I had a great stamina before then, but after that, the stamina was not there, and my posture was markedly visible that it was not good. All right. Now we've seen that this is a rather Neptunian type of person, which you would expect for somebody who studies astrology and is deeply involved with the mysteries. A quality that is associated with the strongest planet in this horoscope, that's coming later. The next thing we're looking at is we're not looking at Neptune Saturn. I don't have any memories of that. That was an opposition anyway. We're now moving down to Neptune conjoined the Sun. This means that after birth, Neptune had gradually transited, and it went over Mars, and then considerably later, it came here to the Sun. And that occurred in 1961 and 1961 and 1962. Now the Sun is always an important planet in every chart because it's the self. It's the way the spirit focuses into the world at all. So the Sun, even if it's not astrologically strong, is still significant anyway. Now, around the time of these conjunctions, I had something of a cycle. I would live with my parents, and I would work in a steel shop to make money and save it up. My parents were gracious enough to let me live at home on their nickel while I saved money. And when I had enough money, I'd go back to college. And I would stay in college until the money was about to run out. And then I would, after the semester was over, I would hang out with the beatniks. And I would do that until the money did run out, and then I would return to my parents, and the cycle would start all over again. Now, in one such cycle, Um, I was visiting a beatnik friend of mine who is the most Neptunian person I've ever met in my life. I can't begin to describe him, but he was a self-taught, fabulous musician and composer of music. Very fine music, 5-part polyphony with a voice part on top of it. Oh, it was just gorgeous. Living with him was, for the music was just wonderful. But I was visiting him after having been in college. I was visiting him on the way to the Orient. I have to admit, I've done some crazy, silly things in life. I was on my way to the Orient because I wanted to become an opium smoker. So I had a pipe dream about having pipe dreams. And I was on my way I hoped to get to Panama, and from Panama to catch a boat to get somewhere in the Orient, like Malaysia or someplace like that, and become an opium smoker. On the way, when passing through Mexico, which was a very eventful trip, I could tell you all sorts of anecdotes about that, but on the way, I contracted a nephritis, which is a kidney infection, and I had contracted it from eating street food that was not clean in Mexico, especially street food associated with what is called olla podrida, which means stink pot soup. And I had to come back to Tucson, and I dallied, and it almost cost me my life, because by the time I got to a doctor, I was no longer had control of urine or anything like that, and I had a reasonably long stay in the hospital. And when I got out of the hospital, I had to work in order to pay the hospital debt off. I worked for the Borden's Milk Company, cleaning milk trucks. And this is not unusual. Often when people are being prepared for a spiritual life, they have serious illnesses. And the serious illness shocks them out of the way of life that they had before. And when from the illness you draw out the soul material that's locked up in the destiny that has not been resolved. The famous poet Goethe had that. He had a very severe illness, and that's when he came into mysticism itself. So in the first part of this that we're looking at with the sun, I became disenchanted with academia. I was an atheist, and I was unsatisfied because what I was getting at the university did not answer to my intuition. And the intuition had been waked up by hanging out with beatniks and artists and people like that. And about this time, in the interaction with the beatniks, I became disillusioned with drug philosophy, which seemed to have a lot of promise, but it didn't. Drugs, everything seems to be specially real and true, but you can't prove it. And when you check things out after your drug experience is over, they aren't what you thought they were under the influence of the drug. But between the second and the third conjunction, I had a true mystical experience. Now, it wasn't spectacular. It wasn't like St. Paul on the way to Damascus to persecute Christians. I did see a light, but it wasn't the kind of light that blinded you and brought Paul into close contact with Christ, which is deep in the spiritual worlds. But it was a light that was enough, that was different than anything I had ever experienced before in my life. And to myself, tacitly, I said I would do anything to serve that light. and the light became very bright, and that was the beginning of a new life. Now obviously this period of the Neptune conjoined the Sun is clearly one of the most important periods in my life. What happened was I became involved with mysticism. First theosophy, but that was just a little too odd for me. But I became interested at the urging of my friend, the musician, that I should study astrology. And so I became interested in studying astrology. And so I went to garage sales looking for astrology books. And in one garage sale, I wish I had written the date down, I found both Max Heindel's Message of the Stars and the Rosicrucian Cosmoconception. And I bought them both because they were for sale for a pittance. And I read the Cosmoconception in 2 days, and it changed my life. It changed my life as much or more than the mystical experience had done. Because the mystical experience led me to know that there was truly something spiritual, but it didn't answer any questions. But the Cosmoconception answered questions that bothered me, and it answered questions that I didn't even know existed. And it changed my life. And all of this took place in between the second and third conjunctions of Neptune and the Sun. When the third conjunction occurred, by that time I was deeply involved with the Rosicrucian movement, and under that third conjunction I moved to Oceanside, California, and worked at the headquarters of that place. Okay, now we've said that the oppositions to Neptune are not as potent as the conjunctions. And that's true even with strong planets like the moon. Those events were not as strong. You know, we're talking about the events that brought in the neurosis, like peeing in my father's boots. But they're not as potent as conjunctions were. Other transiting aspects, squares and trines, some people even use sextiles, and they use with generous orbs of influence. They're awfully faint. With an opposition, things are already faint. I tend to be a little bit careful about the claims that people make about those other aspects in transits. I won't say that the influences aren't there, but the influences are not really very strong. This is something where, you know, that these are things that you have to apply the science of astrology. And the science of astrology, or the effectiveness of astrology, it has 3 pillars that astrology is founded on. And the first is observation. You see what the influences are in yourself, and you see what the influences are on someone who is undergoing an astrological influence of some kind or another. The second pillar of astrology is intuition, because it is a spiritual study. Though some people don't treat it as a spiritual study, but that's their loss. But intuition is the all. You're never going to learn all there is to know about astrology, because knowledge alone can't cover all of the different things. And people are creative, and they keep coming up with new ways to use the astral influences. So it's one of those situations that without intuition, I think astrology is not very good. But intuitions and what we think are intuitions aren't always correct. So you're in the same way that observations have to be interpreted, intuitions have to be tested, And it all gets put together with the third pillar of astrology, which is good, sound judgment. Because you may have what you think is an intuition, and when you look at it with sound judgment, it's pretty pretty far out and not very likely, most likely not even true. Now let's look at we're looking now at the Uranus events. The sun now has come to the point where it's opposite Uranus from 15 something or another in Scorpio. And that didn't produce any major events. Not surprising, it's an opposition which is not as intense. But in that period, I was living in Oceanside, and the Rosicrucian Fellowship is for children of fire, people who have to know, and people who investigate and who are creative. Children of water are people who do things by belief and appeal to authority and things like that. Children of water are associated with churches, and children of fire are associated with schools or with statecraft or things of that nature. And surprisingly, in this period when the sun was opposite Uranus, I saw a lot of struggles. Neptune was opposite Uranus by transit. I saw a lot of struggles between mystics and occultists. In an occult organization, there was way too much religion and not enough put into investigation. That's what that was all about. All right. Now, when we look at this horoscope, we notice that Mercury is clearly the life ruler. In fact, it's very rare that you will see a life ruler that is that outstanding. Now, normally the ruler of the ascendant turns out to be the life ruler because the ascendant indicates the way that you take in and give out. It's the doorway to the external world, which happens to be the physical body. And so whoever rules that doorway usually rules the life for what's coming in and what's going out. So Mercury is life ruler for that reason. Mercury forms the most aspects. It sextiles Neptune, it sextiles the ascendant, it squares Jupiter, and it makes a very strong trine to the moon. So that's another factor in that makes Mercury stand out as a life ruler. The strongest aspect in the horoscope is the almost exact trine of Mercury and the moon. And usually the strongest aspect is a factor in a life ruler. And then the fact that Mercury sextiles the ascendant, this is a very standout Mercury life ruler. And then on top of that, Mercury is in the third house. And the third house is abstractly like the third sign, which is Gemini-like, communications, speaking, writing, interacting with others and brothers and sisters and such like that. So this is what we expect. We're talking now about Neptune having come from its position in Virgo, and now we're talking about the period where it transits Mercury. So we have Neptune conjoined Mercury, and we're looking at this line right here. Come on. All right. We're not disappointed because in terms of what I do in life, this conjunction, five passes of it, are very, very, very significant. in the autumn of 1968, I began making astrological predictions. I had excellent success, and the predictions were made to skeptics. And I soon was doing a lot of predictive work and spending hours and hours at it. And you can't help people with that. If you're predicting, you are a commentator on life. And it's more important, at least for me, it's more important to be a participator. If you are a commentator, you're outside of it. You're looking at what's happening, and your part is to report it, or before the fact or after the fact, but you're not participating. You're not in it. And the thing is that the predictions got me a reputation. And with the reputation, a lot of people wanted to take astrology classes. So in the autumn of 1968, under this aspect, I gave my first course in astrology. And so this was the beginning of a career as a public speaker. It's lasted until this date. I don't know, it's quite too many years. And in the autumn of 1969, 1 year later, all under this conjunction, I opened Microcosm Bookshop. Now, Microcosm Bookshop was a money-losing business. I'll maybe go into it a little bit later, because we're running a little bit long here, longer than I intended. Now, all of these things, a bookstore and a public career, and a speaking career and all that, are consistent with Mercury. However, they describe the Mercury-Neptune quality, but they do not describe another factor that was active at the same time. Now, Neptune could have given me an aura of authority, but it didn't. It would have been an illusion if it had. Now, in the talk previous to this, last month, we discussed the transits of Pluto, the influencer, the planet of power. Now, Neptune and Pluto are the two slowest moving planets that are commonly used in astrology. Both of them were active at the same time. Both of them were influencing the ascendant in Neptune and Mercury. Now, this is highly significant. We'll actually learn a little astrology now. Any time that there is a coincidence between two astrodynamic events, that time is very significant. And it's likely to precipitate events, major events. Not all transits produce events. They produce periods, yes, but events maybe. Now, if there are more astrodynamic events active at the same time, the importance and the likelihood of major events increases according to the number of things that are active. By astrodynamic events, I mean transits and progressions and directions and lunations and a lot of things that we haven't gotten to yet. It might take us years to get to them at the rate that we're going. So, this is true even if the events are not like each other. In this case, everything is involving Mercury and Neptune and Virgo. All of that. But it isn't always that way. Sometimes Saturn will be active and Mars will be active at the same time. And Mars is dynamic and Saturn tries to stop everything down. But if there are if both are activated by different transits or such, that's what the period will be like. That's what life is like. Often we have two tendencies active in our life. One is pushing us forward and another is restraining us. That would be a perfect example of a Mars aspect and a Saturn aspect being by transit being active at the same time. So the astrology is true to life. And so you look for the importance of things when there are coincidences. And the more coincidences that there are, the more important that it is. Now, astrology describes the conditions, and it also describes the options. In this case, I didn't feel I had an option with the Pluto part. I felt there was a compulsion that was beyond myself, that I wasn't quite a dummy, but something of that nature. All right, so the transits that involve Neptune and the transits that involve Pluto that were both active at the same time, they both combined to launch my life of sharing astrology and sharing mysticism. The Neptune sensitivity was there, but there was also a compelling element. Now, we're going to come back to this again because we've got a lot of other things to work with in this horoscope and a lot of other astrodynamic techniques that we have to go through. But this period is probably one of the most important periods in life. All right? Now we move down to, all right, Neptune conjoined Venus. Let's look at the chart. Venus is also in the third house, but it's in Sagittarius. 4 degrees of Sagittarius. It's a lovely planet. It trines Pluto. It sextiles Mars. And it falls somewhere in between a trine, a point in between Saturn and the Moon for a grand trine. So Venus is the only planet in my horoscope that has no unpleasant aspects to it. This transit period is a mystery to me. The mystery is I don't recall the event or even the atmosphere. Now, from experience, I know that Neptune-Venus combinations produce an atmosphere that is fanciful, like Walt Disney cartoons or things like that. Everybody has their own personal fantasies. I don't recall an event. By this time, I had already met the woman who was to become my wife. And I never did have a falling in love with her. I loved her to some extent, still do, but not in the same way. So the fantasy element was not there. So we could chalk this up to a poor memory on my part, but this one is a mystery. I don't have anything to answer. All right, let's go to the next one. The next one is Neptune opposite Pluto. By now, Neptune has moved way over to here, and it is in the 5th house. Pluto is barely in the 11th house, and this took place around 1998. This is also a mystery to me, but a different kind of a mystery. Again, on the final conjunction, the third pass, that is after the retrograde was over, was an important event. It was when I retired from a 30-year profession working for the physics department at the university, and that was the end of that. It's a puzzle. I always wanted to retire early, even if it meant having little to live on, and I was happy to do that. They would have been happy to give me much more wages if I'd have stayed on for another year or two, and I could have had a plush retirement, but I didn't want to do it. I don't understand what Pluto has to do with retirement. I know the event is there, and it's the only major event that occurred at that time, and perhaps there was a compelling influence that I didn't know about, because Pluto has that compelling quality about it. Pluto does rule the third house, but it doesn't have anything. That doesn't have anything to do with retirement. The fourth house is usually the planet that deals with retirement and the things you do at the end of life. If anyone has any idea of why that would be that way, if you have any ideas about it, please send them in. You have the mailing email address, 99fots@gmail.com. That is the address. Now we come to the event of Neptune conjoined Jupiter. So Neptune has started up here and it's come all the way around to here with Jupiter. This occurred on 2009. The event is very simple. At this time, I closed Microcosm Bookshop. Earlier I mentioned that Microcosm Bookshop was opened under the Neptune transiting Mercury for the opening of it. When it came to Jupiter, that was the end of it. Microcosm Bookshop lost money every year. It was never intended to make a profit. I had to pay for on some years I had to pay everything out of my own pocket to make it look like it made money, because if it didn't look like it made money, the government would let me have my tax number and then I couldn't buy books at wholesale. There were books for sale, but the purpose I opened it for one reason, to provide astrological books that you couldn't get at any other bookstores. But it was mostly a place for people to come and discuss spiritual philosophy and discuss astrology. And it turned out to also be a refuge for people to come, troubled people. So it was one of those things. I might be involved with a very brilliant person like the famous Captain Theosophy on one night, and then the next night with a homicidal maniac. And those both are things that occurred in Microcosm Bookshop. As time went on, I became irrelevant, because many people are called to the spiritual path, but very few stick with it. And they move out of town and things like that. And I wasn't attracting young people. Old people, you're young, you don't want to deal with an old guy like that. And so it wasn't as active as it was in the earlier days. And not only were there troubled people, there were some people that hung around a lot that were negative, and they were negative and chased away a lot of people who came for other kinds of discussions. So I just closed the doors on it. And then it was very freeing, as you would expect with Jupiter. After that, after I closed the bookstore, I traveled. And my life became very expanded in that way. Now that's pretty much the transits of Neptune, except right now, Neptune is way over here where the pointer is, and it's opposite its natal position. And Neptune being opposite its natal position from the 6th house and facing a lot of physical illnesses. And the most notable right now at present is I have a skin fungus, and that's a sensitivity to things. And that's exactly the kind of thing that you expect from Neptune opposite the ascendant and natal Neptune. There are other things, but that should be enough for this evening. It lasted longer than I thought it would. If you have questions or comments or answers that are from your own experience, send them along, 99fots@gmail.com. I guess I can put those things up. Let's see, where are they? Thank you very much.